everybody. My name is Tom Shell. As you can see on the screen, I'll be moderating and facilitating some of the dialogue today. I'm very happy to be joined by some distinguished guests. I'll provide some intros in a moment, but we're in interesting times, right? As we think about what's happened over the past year and how we deal with fraud and risk at kind of high degrees and in various different ways. Data and technology are taking on increasing roles. And so today we're going to spend some time talking about how data and technology can come together, some of the issues around that from various perspectives, and then also some of the things that we see coming down the road. So I'm very happy to be joined by Michael Peasley. Michael's the head of trust and safety operations at OfferUp. He's a 20-year veteran in the industry, building and operating anti-abuse platforms for a number of companies. And has really been focusing on payments fraud, account takeovers, everything from that to platform abuse and content moderation. Michael, thanks for joining us. Maybe say hello real quick to everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited for today's discussion.
Oh, that's great. We're also joined by Trevor Anderson. Trevor joins us from Ekata. He's the Senior Director of Field Data Science. Being a pretty data-oriented problem solver, he's passionate about fraud and the impact of fraud to his customers. And so he spent time at Ekata since 2012, leading the field data science team, which, these are the guys in the trenches trying to help customers figure out what data do they need and what data is most valuable in terms of actually finding fraud and dealing with risk. So Trevor, thank you for joining us today. Maybe say hello real quick.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Hello, everybody.
All right, right on. And last but certainly not least, Steve Knopf. Steve's the VP of Products for DataVisor. And he's been doing this for a long time. He looks awfully young, but he's been in this industry for 20 years. In product management, trust and safety, and a number of different leadership and strategy roles in various places. In particular, he's got experience at eBay, LetGo, and OfferUp, protecting literally millions of accounts and people, both in terms of their experience and also the integrity of the transactions and how they interact with those companies. So, Steve, please do say hello.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Looking forward to our discussion.
All right, perfect. Well, I'll tell you what. So a little piece of housekeeping here. We are going to handle and take questions. So, folks, all the attendees, please do pop open your chat window through Zoom. Enter your questions and send those to me. I'll do my best to answer all the questions as we kind of go throughout the session today. And any that we don't get to, we'll make sure that we provide a written response to as a part of the recordings that will be distributed to you after this as well. All right, so I mentioned a little bit, and we're going to kind of jump right in here, and hopefully everyone enjoys the dialogue. We're going to jump right into this notion of kind of data and technology, and we'll talk about different areas of why this is important. And if we think about the backdrop of what's happened to us over the past, I'll say 18 months now, it's a very different world, now than we were experiencing 18 months ago, right? And I think the world shifted in so many different ways, and it's not just how we live our lives, but it's also how business is transacted on an ongoing basis. And so we see new businesses spinning up, new fintechs. You see new business models and products showing up. You see consumers interacting with businesses that they work with in completely different ways, sometimes without bank accounts. And so we have this sort of interesting new landscape where there's a lot of unknown, and if I'll be so bold as to say for everyone in the entire industry, we're all kind of scrambling to figure out, like, how do we deal with these sort of situations, and how do we think about solving the problem? And so one of the ways to do that, right, is through good data. Now, really quickly, DataVisor is a machine learning company, and so it's super data hungry. And having the right data, more than just transactional data is really important. And so maybe I'll start, Trevor, with you. Because you work with Ekata, you work for Ekata, you work with your customers on an ongoing basis around helping them figure out what information they need to find the signal and the noise when it comes to fraud. Tell us a little bit about, what that experience is and the types of things customers are asking you for.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ekata's mission is to be the global standard in digital identity verification. We focus on high scale, high throughput, low latency processing, and for fraud prevention, or maybe there's really two sides of it, right? There's stopping fraud, but also enabling low friction, smooth customer experience. So what my team does is, we work with customers to prove that out. How can you use our data, in your machine learning models and your rule sets, whatever it is, to accomplish those things? The world of identity data certainly is changing, and there's some ways that Ekata is focusing on there. There's sort of a, I kind of maybe even wince a little bit when we say words like identity verification, because that's, in some ways, that's maybe a little bit of an old school view of I want to verify that this user is who they say they are, and if I look and see that name and address and phone and email match, then yep, that's a good user. Well, no, not necessarily anymore, right? With all the data breaches and whatnot's come out, it's very easy for identities to be compromised, as well as synthetic identities that maybe are partially fabricated, but they've been putting in good transactions to build up what looks like a legit identity. So we got to go beyond that. What that means for Ekata is of course, we still do this identity verification per se, matching elements and saying, does this, they seem to go together, but we also increasingly look at behavioral patterns. There's actually, we tend to get, in a lot of cases, even more value out of things like, have we seen this email a long time ago, or does the pattern of, we've seen 1 or 2 addresses used consistently with this phone for the last, long time, is in a lot of ways a stronger, point of low risk than that we, have a match to a name, for example. So there's, generally there's increasing diversity of the data around that, the world of identity verification, but going beyond that verification per se to provide other risk signals that can be used to help drive decisions.
No, that's great, Trevor, because you introduced to me the sort of concept, previously of sort of probabilistic versus deterministic,
yes.
Data or signals, right? And there's this, we think about like, identifying fraud. I mean, the easy solution is, you ask a question, is this fraud or is this a fraudster? And you want a yes or no answer. And in the real world, there's rarely that sort of black and white determination, right? So maybe, tell us about, what's the difference when you think about deterministic versus probabilistic, and why is that important?
So how we would define that deterministic is that word, it determines what you're going to do. And maybe like broadly speaking, things like even a credit score, they have a credit of X, that means I can offer them, a loan of Y, or they've somebody's gone through and done an SMS verification, or they've verified their social security number, their date of birth, these sorts of things that we take as proof points. And those are valuable, right? And we use two-factor auth ourselves or things like that to protect ourselves from fraud, right? So they are valuable. I'm not meaning at all to throw stones at that, but I do believe the world is largely moving toward more what we would call probabilistic signals, things that indicate, a likelihood, a relative likelihood of risk. And I think that's for 2 reasons. One is just the growing reluctance of consumers to share enough data to do those proof points. Like if I can get away without asking for a name, address, phone, email, and IP all at once, the better. And personally, I'm reluctant to offer my social security number, date of birth, unless I already have a pretty high level of trust. So some of that just not feasible anymore. But perhaps even more importantly is sort of, as I mentioned earlier, about the fact that there is so many compromised identities out there. Jane Doe at 123 Main Street may have an excellent credit score, but is that really Jane Doe I'm talking to? That becomes a fuzzier question, and there is no single silver bullet or proof point that can make it say yes, especially on an online transaction. And that raises the need for more of this I'll say fuzzy or probabilistic data that helps you at least bin things into different risk-based cohorts. If I feel relatively certain this is a good good consumer, then I can put them through a lower friction, smoother track. If I feel less certain this is a higher risk cohort, I can do some more due diligence, ask for some more documentation. So yeah, that world of sort of confirm good, confirm bad is largely going away, and we need to think of things a little bit more in terms of likelihoods and take respective actions accordingly.
No, that's great, Trevor. Well, and I think it rolls us into kind of a technology discussion a bit too. And so maybe Steve, you could speak for a couple minutes on how important good data is, because I'm a former military guy, right? So I think in terms of like the fog of war, there's a lot of stuff going on everywhere. There's a lot of noise. There are a lot of signals. There's a lot of data that we can interrogate, but having the right sorts of data and applying that to some interesting technologies is how we end up coming up with a signal, right, that's useful for helping us make a decision. Maybe let me talk a little bit from your perspective, what you've seen in the past, and maybe how this plays into your day job here at DataVisor.
Yeah, Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that question. Actually, as Trevor was talking about identity verification, I had a question for you, Trevor, and I'll sort of interweave the question in with my answer, and then maybe you can answer it. So you had spoken about how when you think of identity verification, you think of, do you have a name, address, phone match, any other sort of, text-based identity verifications that you might be able to triangulate together to see like, hey, is this really that person? So at my previous company, to register on the website, you only had to provide an email address, or you could use Facebook or Google. But we offered the ability for people to verify their identities with an actual physical driver's license. And I'm wondering, my question for you is, and I'll sort of finish, is do you view physical, like driver's license, passport identity verification as a higher verification than maybe name, address, phone match? Because you can't, name, address, phone, you could go to the, phone book and grab all this stuff. But to get an identity, a driver's license is difficult. And then to match your actual face with that driver's license is pretty difficult. And so Tom, anyway, in answer to your question, so the previous company I worked for, it's on my bio, right? It's Letgo. We were very friction averse. So basically we tried to let everybody on the website that had a pulse, right? Like we would let you on, but then we offered the ability for those people to verify information about them that would reduce our risk perception of that user and allow them to use different features of the application and sort of help onboard them. And some of those were, SMS verification, email verification. We had some risk signals around email and phone number. And then we implemented driver's license, passport identity verification. And what I actually found very interesting about that is, so the vendor that we chose, I'm not going to mention their name, but we went back and forth in the contract negotiation about, well, how many IDs do we think are going to verify? And so I came up with some really small number. I said, oh, people aren't going to do this. Nobody wants to provide their driver's license, and nobody wants to go through the process of taking a picture of that driver's license, then taking a picture of themselves and doing all stuff. Well, I was wrong. Like we basically had 10 to 20x the number that I thought, and we used up all of our credits that were meant for a year, and we used them up in, I think, 5 or 6 months. So that experience taught me that, hey, users are willing, if they think there's value in verifying their identity or validating their identity, then they'll do it, even as far as taking a picture of their driver's license and providing it to us. And we viewed that as sort of I wouldn't say gold standard, but we certainly thought that if somebody provided their identity and it matched and passed the vendor's sort of matching process, we viewed that as, pretty significant. And then we were able to triangulate that data with any other data that they provided us to make, if they provided us name, address, phone, we could say, hey, does it match the identity, the address, or at least close to what's on the driver's license and any other information we had about them, IP, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Steve. I don't know, Trevor, if you wanted to respond to his earlier question about this from Ekata's perspective.
Yeah. So on one hand, absolutely. I mean, it does, getting someone to share their driver's license and verifying the information on there, their picture, provide more assurance than, the text-based identity matching. Absolutely, right? Yeah, certainly. I think it's more a question of, like you said, there's some cases where people are going to be willing to, and some they won't. When I'm using a site to say I'm booking a cabin for a week or something, and those folks want to me to put in my driver's license, I say, all right, that seems fine to me. It's a significant amount of money, and I'm going to be at a physical location. I was this is maybe a year or two ago, but signing up for a neighborhood-based social media site, and they asked the same thing, and boy, no, that was a lot different. There's no money exchanging hands here. I'm not willing to give you that level of data about myself. So I think there's contexts where some are more or less feasible. And sometimes, maybe if you frame it right, there could be more willingness to say, well, I want to, help protect myself by making sure that you know who I really am. But yeah, there are cases, though, I believe, where there's going to be more reluctance for that based on the service. And then you're kind of stuck with, what do I do when I can't, achieve that really tight assurance that you get from those sorts of measures?
That's really interesting. And Michael, I may ask you to help me with this, because you may be jumping in here to talk about this anyways, because I know that sort of customer friction, right, is a big deal, right? And there's different levels of customer friction based on the perceived value of the platform that you're on, the interaction, and how much data you want to say, and how many authentication requests do you want to have a customer go through, how much more information. How do you balance that out, in your day job?
Yeah, so definitely. So just starting with, kind of on this ID thing, it really, in the real world, it boils down to value props for the user, right?
Yeah.
You're going to go book a cabin for the weekend. Yeah, this is kind of a big deal. The value is there. You're going to provide this information. If you're on a platform where you're not sure what the hell you're getting out of it, you're going to not want to do that, right? Also, in a system where that type of verification is kind of like what Steve mentioned, which is kind of like it's opt-in. You can do it if you want. I mean, we could have predicted all of the good users that were going to do it, right? Because the good users are going to do it to try and prop up their profiles and make sure that people can see them as trusted, whereas those that are not good they're probably not going to do it either, right? So that's where friction really comes into play for me in the sort of operations world, is trying to understand the right moments to apply friction and what that type of friction is. Again, it gets back to that value prop. Okay, should you put this at the very front door? Probably not, right? Because again, it goes back to that, what's the value of me doing this? I don't even know what's behind the door yet, right? Why am I going to give up all this information? So it's really critical to understand that point at which someone is going to more likely provide this sort of identity information. And so you're going to see less churn, higher success rates when you figure out the right places to put that. And again, depends on your platform what those levels of friction are going to be. I mean, from as basic as identifying or validating an email address all the way to, bank account verification or, physical ID verification, things like that.
Well, there's an interesting topic, right, at this sort of, confluence of sort of data and customer experience and kind of, the technology and the platforms, how people perceive value. Do you think that there are ways in which technology can simplify and ease the friction? Because there's always going to be some friction, right? Anytime a user's interacting with machines, right? There's just going to be some friction, right? Are there technologies or approaches that you think about that help with that?
Yeah, there's definitely, the kind of the way that I think a lot about it is we're trying to use our data and technology really to identify a cohort of users that, for whatever reason, this probabilistic, systems, we need to put friction upon those users and not other users, right? I mean, that's the whole sort of goal, I would say, and that's where all of this data comes into play, right? This is why it's so important to expand your world of data, of not just your own data, but getting in this other data, through something like Ekata or whatever, so that you can make a much better decision of who might be risky. And again, like a lot of times, you're going to put that friction in front of a user like that with the goal of that they're not going to do it, right? So actually low pass rates mean you're doing a good job for the most part, right? If you have really high pass rates, as Steve just mentioned, like people just do it, that are good, that's not exactly how we want to use this sort of type of system.
Right. Well, and this gets a little bit back to, and Steve, that I think I'll direct to you, or a question I'll direct to you, Steve. This gets us back to this again, we're trying to balance, user experience and technology. And to some degree, right, in the machine learning world, right, and the fraud detection world, you get all these various ways in which you can see potential fraud, right? There's simple things like, rules-based detection, which, is fairly black and white, right? You meet a set of conditions or you don't. And then there's machine learning, which does a better job of anticipating, right, and dealing with things like false positives and negatives, right? So that you're not letting fraudsters kind of get through the sieve, and you're not letting customers get caught up in the whole detection process. And then there's this, the more novel machine learning approaches like unsupervised machine learning, which is really focused on finding the connections that just aren't intuitively obvious or aren't directly observable, right? And so technology has a role there in helping us see what we can't see. And do you think that, Steve, actually helps from a customer experience standpoint if we have that kind of technology? And maybe what do you think the value of those sorts of detection techniques are?
Yeah, so I do think they're very valuable, and it's always good, right? As a customer, you don't, there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes, and you don't always want to know what those things are because everyone's got their perceptions about, companies and applications collecting data. But unsupervised machine learning is great, especially for because at the end of the day, you're trying to protect your customers from the bad guys or from a bad experience on your site or a bad transaction or any number of things. And you're also trying to protect the company from those. So unsupervised machine learning really helps. It helped us at LetGo and obviously now I'm at DataVisor. And so we provide that technology to a number of companies. It helps a lot with organized fraudulent attacks, sort of high volume, high velocity. But there's other technologies that I found very useful as well, like device ID, right? So device ID really is helpful in curbing not only those sorts of attacks, large mass scale fraudulent, well-organized attacks, but also the more simpler, just some guy that's out to defraud people from a few bucks or try to cause a bad experience, because that person will come on, cause a bad experience, get kicked off the platform or whatever, and then try to come back. And if you don't have a way of basically saying like, hey, we've seen that device before, we've seen this user before, because it's like Trevor talked about, you can change your identity, right? There's data that you can access off the web to basically create a new ID. And depending on the platform and whatnot, they may require, more detailed information about you or less detailed, like LetGo did in terms of just an email or Facebook. But device ID sort of helps take that to a next level because we're basically taking a fingerprint of the device and saying, hey, we've seen that device before. And it becomes expensive for users to have to cycle through devices in order to use your application or your bank or your web.
So another barrier to entry, the way Michael described it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing is it's like a global intelligence network, right? Because as a company, you only have the data on your particular users. But if you can get data on sort of similar users that are part of a global intelligence network, whatnot, then you can start saying, hey, that user may not have caused problems on our website yet, but they've caused problems elsewhere. And you can get that access and make decisions based on that.
Oh, interesting. So, Steve, do you think, is there such thing as too much data? Like, can you have too many data sources and too much data around transactions or whatever use case you're interested in kind of trying to find fraud signals in?
I would say no, provided you have provided you have the capacity, the computing capacity to use that data.
In the real world, you can't have too much.
Yeah, I guess that's right. You can't outstrip your ability to process it, right? I guess it is interesting, right? I think we're in a world now where cloud-based infrastructure gives us a lot of options, right? I mean, you can do things today that you would never have contemplated doing, 10 or 15 or 20 years ago if you're having to build all the hardware yourself, right? It's just completely talk about a barrier to entry. But let's flip this around. I mean, Trevor, a question for you. Is there such thing as good data versus bad data? Like another way to ask the question, right? I mean, is there, we talk about having lots and lots of data sources, but are there some data sources that are just more valuable and more useful in detecting fraud than others?
Well, I mean, certainly there's things, there's things that maybe, denial lists or things like that can become stale depending on how you do them. There's, the more kind of people who, like for identity data, there's sources providers where you're ingesting, say, a file a quarter and keep it on premises, that again kind of suffers from the same sort of thing. So like we do really focus hard on trying to make sure that we have as much up-to-date data, both on like the linkages between identity elements, as well as what we see their behaviors and how that changes minute by minute. But I think I do want to speak just briefly on the question of kind of too much data, because that's something that is actually we look at on the Ekata side as well. We offer both kind of granular data points. Does the email match the name? How many days ago did we first see this IP or last see this IP or things like that? But we also provide machine learning based features. I'll take our IP risk flag, for example, and a point of question that we need to debate internally is, what do we do? Should we just return all of the granular data we have? Or should we roll things up into scores or other machine learning based flags? And I think that the challenge we see is, on one hand, the more data you have, generally the better, if you have the systems to handle it. But I think that's a great point that Michael brought. And at some point, there's competition for features within a model, for example, means that you might be better off, say, building a submodel, rolling up some data around some particular aspect. You might be better off using one machine learning based score as a feature in your model than taking all of that submodel's features, including them in yourself. And that's something we try to strike the right balance. Some customers are going to have very nuanced needs and need some more granular data, but most really are going to get more value from us if we return just the highest performing signals and some machine learning derived attributes than kind of boiling the ocean and returning 1,000 different data points, each of which might be not so strong on their own. The model feature selection process picks the top 10, and you're not getting as much value as if we'd done some of that work for you. So that's an area to consider as well. If you have a ton of data, is how you aggregate that together to make better decisions.
No, that's great. That's great insight. So look, if I was a CTO, like I just want one of everything. Like I'll subscribe to every data source, and I want all the best detection technologies I can play. Let's say I've got all the money in the world, right? I mean, obviously that's not a realistic, right, approach to anything. But it does sort of force a question, and this would be interesting, and maybe in turn, Steve and Michael, you guys can offer some insight. How do you make a determination as to what the right mix of technologies are? Like, is it use case or industry, or which data you can easily get to, the impact to the user? I mean, there's a lot of competition, and there are a lot of different ways, right, to solve the problem. How do you think about constructing what's right for your organizations? And maybe Michael, you could start.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Definitely real world. One of the key considerations is going to be cost, right? Again, as Trevor mentioned, like, you could go out and get a ton of data, but really, ultimately you want to figure out what is the most valuable from, the point of view of what you're trying to accomplish, right? A lot of what was mentioned here, I think early on, was looking at behavioral-based data. Well, behavioral-based data, a lot of times, is going to be your own data. And so that's going to be prioritized very, very high. And again, that looks really great on the cost side as well. But that's not always going to get us where we need to go. And so at that point, there's a lot of different sort of testing or trying things out, seeing how they perform, and really trying to grab as much of that problem as you can, with as low of a cost as possible. Like that's
sure.
on my side of the fence, that's really critical. Right. So again, it's going to be probably comparing these different sort of third-party, data to the problem. And again, the other thing to just be aware of too is, like, a lot of times you can think about trying to create a lot of this data yourself, but as Steve mentioned too, it's really important to sort of get that outside view. I think IP address is one of those things, right? Like you IP address is super critical. It's also something that it doesn't have a shelf life. Like, so yeah. It's always changing, right? Your IP ratings might only be valid for days, right?
Oh,
so
interesting.
So having someone that can help you out with that is critical, or else you can definitely run into some issues. So yeah.
Yeah, and Steve, on your side, I mean, we almost, as a vendor building technologies, we almost have kind of an opposite problem, right? I mean, we'd like to build one of everything, right, and kind of solve all the problems we can if we had unlimited resources. But how do we think about like minimum viable product, right? Minimum viable solution for fraud detection, right? I mean, what's your thinking in terms of how you put together the right things as a part of a platform that we can offer customers?
Yeah, so I sort of come back to, so I'll tell a story about a vendor we used at my previous company, Letgo. So we just wanted to verify phone numbers, right? We just wanted the ability for people to enter their phone number. We send them a text string, and they tell us what the text string was, which verifies their phone number. But of course, that vendor has other technologies that they want us to use, but it comes down to, are they valuable to us? How much do they cost? And sort of back to my previous answer, all things being equal, I'll take all the data and then I can choose what to use. If I have to pay for it, well, then it's a different story. But so this vendor was verifying phone numbers for us, but they said, hey, we can tell you what carrier that phone number's from. We can tell you how long it's been in existence, where it's registered. We have a phone number risk rating. We have all this stuff. And of course, at first I was like, oh no, we're good. We don't need that. We just want to verify the phone number. Well, then like a good vendor does, they say, well, we'll give it to you for free for a little while. You try it out, tell us whether you think it's valuable or not. Well, so we started using it, and it provided a huge amount of uplift from just a risk score, right? So we're like, man, that's a risky phone. It's coming from Google Voice. It's like they could tell us all kinds of things about it. And so then we just ran kind of our simple algorithm, our formula with like, well, how much fraud has it prevented versus how much fraud would have gotten through without it? And we were able to come up with an ROI based on, they gave it to us for free. So they set the hook, and we and we tried it out, and then we realized, like, man, if we lose this, we're going to lose the data signals on all these bad transactions, all these bad users. So, we figured out how much it's worth, and we discussed pricing with them. And DataVisor, we're the same, right? We've got a lot of different products. Our sort of core products is a unsupervised machine learning, but we've got rules engine, we've got feature platform, we've got device fingerprinting, we've got all this stuff. And if we could have the way we wanted, we could sell all of it. But some customers come to us and say, hey, we just need the UML, right? And so we sell them the UML, or we hope to sell them the UML. We sell them the UML, and then we try to show them the value of the other products, and hopefully those values are a positive ROI for them, and like it was for us at Letgo with the phone risk rating.
So like the takeaway that I get, in listening to both you, Steve, and Michael, are that you can never stop evaluating the value, and you can never stop looking for where the holes are. Like it's an ongoing process and discipline that, just continues every single day because things are constantly changing. Mm-hmm. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. Yeah. I think it's fair. And the other thing is, you may have a data point that you don't view as terribly relevant, but that could change a few months or a few years down the road. The other thing is your data scientist, whatever, may say, hey, that's a pretty useless data point by itself, but if I combine it with these other data points and create this new feature, then it's really valuable. And if you don't have that data point, if you never had it in the first place, you would know that.
So maybe that's the big takeaway for all of our attendees, right? Is to think in terms of who is it that can help constantly evaluate and reevaluate, looking for new threats that are showing up, looking for new capabilities that can augment, what you're doing today. And this all gets a lot harder too, because if you think about some of the things that are happening, and one of the things I've noticed, and I've talked to a lot of partners in my role in kind of alliances for DataVisor, there's this notion of, I kind of broadly call it convergence in the industry, right? I think you go back a number of years, you kind of had KYC vendors in a place and fraud vendors in a place, and AML and fin crime guys, kind of downstream. now what we're finding is that in RFPs and conversations with partners that are, helping customers design, large kind of risk management programs, that all of these different technologies that were once distinct in different parts of the org are all, customers want them to work together. Like, so from a KYC standpoint, some of that information and the data that's associated with that is just as valuable in terms of account origination as it is in fraud detection, as it is in dealing with money laundering, for instance. And what you learn from a money laundering system or a transaction management system should feed back into your fraud prevention capability, right, and vice versa. Does it get harder when you start to think about how well integrated all of these capabilities need to be, and how what you learn in one place needs to inform, what you're doing somewhere else? I mean, what do you think about that, Michael?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of truth to that. I mean, I think at some point that those probably separate a bit more depending on what some of those issues are. But looking at something like a marketplace type of platform that I've been involved in, yeah, those things are very, very, very closely related. Absolutely, you're spot on.
So Steve, from a product standpoint, I mean, how are we thinking about combining these worlds? Because I think one of the things we've seen from a pure machine learning standpoint is, machine learning was kind of, it grew up in the digital fraud space, but now I can't tell you how many RFPs we've seen as a company where people who are looking for only an AML solution are looking for AI and ML in the mix somehow. That they're not even sure how they want it used, right? But what they know is that traditional transaction monitoring is not good enough. Steve, what do you think about how these worlds are starting to come together, and what does that mean in terms of the mix of technologies people should be thinking about as well?
Yeah, so so as a trust and safety sort of business owner at a couple of startups, trust and safety, this area, even fraud prevention detection, sort of this area that people don't know a lot about. And so you'll say, hey, I need this technology, I need this data, and they're like, no, what's the business purpose? What would you do with it? And sometimes you have a clear business purpose of how you would use it. Sometimes you're like, hey, look, I have a toolbox, and I know eventually I'm going to need a paint scraper. I don't need it right now, but eventually I'm going to need a paint scraper, and I don't want to have to build the paint scraper when I need it. I just need it in the toolbox. And so I view the technologies that we provide, and the technologies, this convergence is basically putting an inventory of tools together that you can use depending on the risk that you're seeing, but depending on the behavior you're seeing and the activity you're seeing. And the convergence is sort of having those available to you to help detect and fight your whatever problem you're having.
Well, interesting. Well, and we constantly have to balance that with making sure that the technology doesn't become a blocker, right? It can't be it's got to be an enabler, not a blocker, right, to the customer experience and kind of the speed of business. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing is, as you mentioned, some you don't know what you don't know, right? So sometimes you'll be speaking with a potential customer, or it could be in a business related purpose. It could be something else where if they don't know that the technology is available or that it even exists, then they're not going to consider it in their thought process. So our job is to educate, stay on top of all the leading edge technology and where things are going, like blockchain and sort of some of those type things, and figure out, is that a service that our customers could use? Should we be offering it? Should we partner? We don't know exactly how to use it yet, and I'm depending on what the technology is, but it clearly seems like this is taking on steam and would be relevant or valuable down the road.
Okay, interesting. Well, look, let's have a little fun, because I like this next segment, because we'll get into kind of what's coming, what's on the horizon, like these really big disruptors, some of which may not even, may not pan out, they may not even exist yet, but there are a lot of interesting things happening, right? And, and I think in terms of the world of financial services, where we spend a lot of time, but you think about, crypto and blockchain and peer-to-peer networks, you see regulatory agencies really tightening down and being more firm about, the types of things that banks and organizations should pay attention to. Money laundering, related use cases, human trafficking, domestic terrorism, are all things that are getting a lot of press these days, and we're starting to see, interestingly, an RFP just showed up from another customer where, they want to understand, like, how can DataVisor detect fraud that's, floating through a distributed ledger like a blockchain, right? So maybe let's do crystal ball mode, right? I'll start with you, Trevor. What's coming? What are some of these big things that you see coming from customers, and how is Ekata thinking about approaching, some of these big disruptors that are affecting the industries?
Yeah, certainly. I guess I see two things. One, like the increasing concerns about privacy. And I see some of that on crypto. Some is more people using it as sort of investment tool or whatever, but less willingness to share some of that PII, that personal information that we've talked about before. And our side, there's really a couple of things we're doing there. One is we're really looking to refine our product suite. In years past, we've had sort of a Swiss Army knife or one-size-fits-all identity verification product. But increasingly, we in the last couple of years shifted toward more purpose-built products, because in terms of the fraud profile, the kind of fraud that happens, the amount of data you have, something like a physical goods e-com purchase versus a digital gift card purchase, or an account sign up on a bank versus an account sign up on a dating site or a crypto marketplace, right? These all are super different, and different amounts of data available. And that's becoming more nuanced. So in years past, it was, oh, it's an e-com scenario and you're doing identity verification. All right, name, billing address, shipping address, phone, email, IP. That's 90% of all of our customers are doing the same thing. It's not the case anymore. So we need to have products, suited to, more cases, more limited inputs, or as well as different behaviors. And then also in terms of how we protect the identity data we receive, and that privacy angle is also, we this is more of a story maybe of a year or two ago than a story of today, but making sure that we're fully compliant with GDPR and CCPA and regulations that way, making sure that everything is fully encrypted, one-way hashed, and continuing down that road to ensure the privacy and security of our customers, especially in a space that if how identity data is collected by a third-party company is something near and dear to the hearts of many consumers. We need to make sure that we are trusted by the merchants we work with, and how we'll deal with their customers' data.
Well, do you think, and just a quick follow-up question, do you think we ever get to this notion of a universal absolute identity? I mean, I think about like the medical records, right, issue that we have, right, where we really want to carry around a secure version. We give limited access to who that is, but what if we had some sort of a token, right, that we could enable for some period of time that absolutely proved who we were, right, and was absolutely tied to a transaction? Do you think we'll ever get to that point from a technology or data standpoint?
Of course, I'm a little doubtful, and I think there's certainly a large part of the population who I just don't think would be willing to adopt that. It might be the sort of thing where we see today, where there's a certain segment that would say, yeah, I'm going to do it, and then you can trust me and we'll get through. And there's still going to be a large minority, I think, that won't, that still has this this question of, are you just really privacy conscious, or are you a fraudster trying to get through? So it's something that provides an authoritative, yes, you're a good customer, no, you're a fraudster. I don't see that. But are there future things that can be offered that I could see a scenario of something along those lines that might be a good argument for a consumer. Says, this isn't you sharing your actual identity data with with a company who's maybe going to start texting you and calling you. I don't want that. So something in lieu of that I might be willing to, but I don't think it would form a silver bullet as such.
It's an interesting topic, right? Because I think you look at what's happened with Facebook data, kind of being breached in different places, and Cambridge Analytica and other things. This whole notion of like we should own our own identities, and then how that plays and how we use it. Interesting topic that's going to continue to unfold for a while. Well, so Steve, over to you. I think. And as we were preparing for this, we talked a little bit about sort of blockchain and sort of challenges that potentially creates. We've seen some customers where we've done some POCs where, there is no bank involved in terms of the transfer of funds or value or monetary, right? There are demographies that are being served with a digital wallet on a mobile phone, right? And so there's no bank account. We think about where transactions can hide and where transactions are taking place. what concerns you about, the ability to sort of be able to detect fraud in those sorts of scenarios? And it seems like there's something new happening in the industry every single day. I mean, China's got its own cryptocurrency that they're launching, right? That they've recently released. And there's some question about what does that mean, right? I mean, blockchain's pretty useful, but it's also built to be somewhat opaque, right? So how do you start to see fraud when, we don't have these traditional systems and data flows to tap into?
Yeah, man, they scare me to death. You sort of have to take them on a one-by-one basis, and that is, think about what's it replacing and what's it intended to do, and then what ways is there to take advantage of it, from a fraudster, and a lot of times these technologies are built with that in mind, and a lot of times they're built, to achieve a purpose, and then the abuse or fraudulent nature of how that technology can be abused is not thought of originally. They have to go back and sort of re-architect. At the end of the day, it's just I don't know how to think of it. It depends on what we're specifically talking about. But blockchain, I know enough to be dangerous, but I don't know everything there is to know about blockchain. Same with virtual currency. But I just look at how is it used and what's it replacing, and how can we sort of get our heads around it and figure out what risks are associated with those, and what behaviors do we see that tell us it's being abused or not being is not authentic.
Yeah, so the whole data and context and behavioral side of things becomes super important.
Yeah,
then, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So the technology play and the data play. Well, Michael, I mean, from you, I'd love to get your sense and feeling from this. I know you've got some thoughts around blockchain in particular.
Sure.
And I'll just some context. We run into social platforms periodically that are all looking for ways to monetize their customers' experiences, right? And one of the ways that some folks are doing that is they're tokenizing the experience. For those folks who are building content that pulls other people onto the platform, right? They get rewarded with some kind of value that's it's valuable on that platform, not anywhere else, but that becomes almost a microeconomy, right?
Sure.
How do you see these things sort of unfolding and the impact it's having on businesses like yours?
Yeah, definitely. It brings into a whole new type of challenge and abuse, right? Exactly what you just talked about. I mean, think of even as something as simple as creating a appointment to get a COVID vaccine shot can be monetized by someone, right? By going in and booking up all of the appointments and then selling them, right? So there's anytime there's a system out there like that has some sort of perceived value, it's going to be exploited.
That's interesting. I mean, do you see blockchain taking on a more prominent role in terms of kind of fraud detection or these sorts of transactions?
I go back to some of the stuff that it's an uphill battle to bring together something that is sort of like a portable sort of reputation, if you will, right? So that, I mean, ideally, like, that would be amazing, to be able to say, hey, I've done these transactions over here, and I've done this over here, and this is me, and I'm a great person. And, but one, I think platforms do have some issues with that, right? I mean, think about Amazon and how important their reputation and review systems are to them. So there's definitely roadblocks and challenges of something like that happening. I know there's been some attempts to do some things like that, but just going back to some of the stuff that Steve was talking about, and you brought up to start this with. Look, I mean, I think some of the reasons we're nervous maybe about this bankless money transfers and cryptocurrency and things like that is it's just new and a little bit unknown. All current systems have flaws, right? I mean, the current banking system is abused daily. So, you know, again, it's just, it might be a different type of challenge, but, you know, think about like Bitcoin is not really that anonymous anymore because governments have sort of put all of these things in place. Can you get Bitcoin anonymously? Yeah, but it's not like super straightforward, right? You know, you're going to have to go through identity. You're going to have to go through almost like traditional banking type of regulations just to even buy Bitcoin.
Right. So the real windows of vulnerability then are when new disruptors emerge, right? It's kind of the same way the fraud detection, right? When a new pattern shows up, right? Everyone's at risk until that pattern gets identified and you can do something about it and you put frameworks around it, right?
Yeah.
So.
And in between it, everyone is like, you know, super nervous about it, right? Because it's the new thing.
Well, it goes back to this constant discipline, right? We have to constantly keep looking for what's new and what's emerging.
Yeah.
Now, I do just want to quickly remind all of our attendees that we are taking some questions. So please do jump into chat if you've got a specific question. And in fact, you know, we got one for Steve, actually. Steve, you talked a little bit about I think we all kind of talked about the importance of data, but, you know, specifically because it relates to some of the technologies, you know, how easy or difficult is it to integrate data into typical work streams, right? It's easy to say, hey, I've got a new, you know, data source over here. It's going to solve the world's problems, but actually taking that and kind of overlaying it, inserting it, ingesting it, figuring out what it is, and applying it to rules and models and everything else. How do you tackle that? Oh, and you're muted, Steve. Yeah.
I was worried about that. Yeah, so I pulled this question up a few minutes ago, and I've been looking at it as we've been here talking about. So I've never met a data source we couldn't integrate, right? So we'll figure out a way. Now, how easy or difficult it is, it depends. It depends on whether there's an API built, you know, to gain access to the data, and how's the data structured, and how big the data set is, and it depends on a lot of those things, but. At the end of the day, we've always been able to integrate the data somewhere into the system so that it can be used and leveraged, you know, by the platforms or the products that we built. So I wouldn't be so worried about how easy or difficult it is to integrate. I'd be more worried about, is it useful data? Is it going to provide value? And do we have to pay money for it? I mean, there have been, I know PR is looking for like an example. I can't think of a data source that whether it's been a DataVisor or a previous company, that we really struggled to integrate it into our work stream. Like, it's always, you know, you know, first of all, I'm not the one sitting down writing the code to integrate it into the work stream. I'm the one writing the requirements for the data and how we're going to use it and what tools it needs to be made available to. It's the engineers that implement and integrate that data. And I think I've been lucky that we have smart engineers that have been able to integrate the data.
Is it fair to say, Steve, that you know, the state of the art in technologies that exist in the market today are pretty robust in terms of pulling in, you know, various data sources and kind of mapping it together, versus where it might have been 5 or 10 years ago when, you know, everyone's in a Jupyter notebook trying to figure out like how the data munges together, and you're handwriting some features and that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, data has become, you know, and is becoming sort of one of the most, you know, there's companies built on simply having data that they sell to other companies. And you know, data is, I hate this term, but I'm going to use it. Data is king, right? So if you have data and you want to sell it or make it available, you're not only going to collect the data, but you're going to make it so that it's easy to digest.
Yeah,
and
that makes sense.
Most of these companies, I think, you know, realize that and are, you know, whether it's DataVisor or another data provider, are making their data sources sort of easy to integrate.
Well, that's a good thought, right? And I think it brings us back to something we've touched on a couple of times, right? As we kind of wrap up, yeah, I think, you know, everybody needs to be constantly on the lookout for disruptors, for risks. They need to be evaluating data sources, you know, on an ongoing basis, not just once and then, you know, walk away from it. Look at new technologies constantly, because, you know, as things change, and this past year has been a pretty good example of this. Things change pretty radically. We just constantly need to be retesting and looking for those things that can provide value, and that ultimately, you know, to Michael's point, balances customer experience and friction with the value and investment that both customers and businesses get from these, various data sources and technologies. So great discussions, guys. Thank you for joining us today. I think this has been, I think it's given our attendees something that maybe they weren't expecting, some sort of thinking outside the box and some real world application of how you figure out how to balance all these competing, aims and objectives, right? When it comes to, data, technologies, and business needs that drive what we do. So, guys, thank you very much. And I think with that, we will wrap up today's webinar. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.